Justin Ehrenhofer is here today to talk about Monero. He's from US, he's studying in Vienna right now. And yeah, I look really forward to his presentation. Let's give him a big hand.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate all of you coming out today. We had a good turnout, so I'm glad we were able to fill the space. So today I'm here to just talk about Monero. And can I see a show of hands real quick? How many people have at least heard of Monero before? Okay, that's basically everyone. So how many people are familiar with how Bitcoin works in general? So if you wanted to explain the basics of the blockchain, or in general those basic concepts that you could answer, you could at least convince someone that you knew what you're talking about. There we go, so a few more hands. So I'm here today to convince you all that I know what Monero is. Yeah, so I'm just going to start off just talking about the basics of Monero. Monero is a cryptocurrency that adds within the protocol privacy for all the transactions within the system, so you don't need to go through any additional steps to get privacy. You can just use Monero and know that it's already built into the system. This is very different than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is fantastic because it was the first time that you had a decentralized system where you didn't need to trust any participant in the system, but it is completely transparent. You will always see when you make a Bitcoin transaction that a certain amount in Bitcoin, a known amount, went from one account to another wallet address. And that's recorded for everyone to see. And if someone here was like, okay, well, prove that I have my holdings, I mean, I don't know your wallet address, but exchanges will know your wallet address. Whoever you send or receive money to or from know your address. And so there are connections to your account in that way. And even to a large attacker that's able to analyze the data in the blockchain with temporal analysis, it's pretty easy, even if you're trying to hide your tracks, to de-anonymize basically the history of how the Bitcoin are used. And so Monero really tries to solve this issue for just the two reasons of giving people the privacy that a lot of people want. And for many people, it could be just as simple as, hey, I don't want everyone else to know my wallet balance. So in real life practice, I don't know how much money everyone here has. What if they all knew how much Bitcoin you had? So, and if it was more commonly used, that could be a big problem. And then second is this crazy word called fungibility. You don't need to remember it. It's definitely a strange word. I didn't hear about it until I started learning about Monero. But it's just the general idea that you could exchange two notes of the same value and no one would lose out. With Bitcoin, if I had one Bitcoin and someone else had one Bitcoin and we switched, that might not actually be the case anymore. Some of you may have heard earlier this year about the WannaCry ransomware attack on the UK National Health Service systems. If I was trying to give any of you WannaCry money that you knew my Bitcoin was previously taken from people with this ransomware attack, would any of you accept it? I wouldn't accept it if you guys are trying to give me WannaCry money. So it's up to the merchant or whoever's receiving it to go through and search the history of how the money was spent, or else they're putting themselves at risk. So exchanges will not allow deposits if it was used for certain money laundering schemes or so forth, even if you weren't the one to actually use it for that reason. So it's important in the money system to have fungibility, which Monero brings to the digital system. Cash has this property. You don't need to worry about it with cash. And it just tries to re-implement it, and privacy is really necessary to do that. So just for me to introduce myself real quickly, my name is Justin Ehrenhofer. I just finished my second year of university studying finance and management information systems. Online on Reddit, you might see me as Samsung Galaxy Player or SGP on IRC. No, I receive money from Samsung or anything. I'm not sponsored by them. But this is just the name of the account, name of the phone I was using to access Reddit on when I made the account. and at this point I'm kind of stuck with it. So there I am, Samsung Galaxy player. I'm a student at the University of Minnesota, and there I also I'm a co-president of my school's cryptocurrency club there, and I just wrapped up my 5-month study abroad program at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, so I'm just kind of concluding traveling and giving a few talks with it now before I go back to the United States. So just to give a quick history of decentralized systems in general, because Bitcoin is a decentralized system, but it's not the first. There were several that predated it by several years that were released in like between 2000 to 2003. Some of these you may have heard of before. So Napster itself isn't decentralized, but it's based off the Bittorrent protocol, which allows people to share files. So many of you may have at least heard of torrents before. And it allows people on a decentralized network to share files. That's an example of a decentralized network. Many of you have heard of Tor before. Can I just see how many people have heard of Tor before? Okay, so everyone here. And so Tor is an example of a decentralized model that people use to get privacy. Other ones that are less commonly known are Freenet, I2P, which I'll talk a lot more about later, and Tox. These are all services, they're all different decentralized services. And Napster wasn't really used for privacy, but all of the other ones on here, Tor, Freenet, I2P, and Tox, they were all used for privacy. And there's a reason that privacy and decentralization really go hand in hand. Because with the decentralized system, you don't need to trust anyone. And it's a good idea if you want privacy not to be reliant on some centralized party for you to be able to maintain your privacy. It's a lot better for you to be able to put that in a decentralized system. So that's what a lot of these other projects do, is they allow you to get privacy in the decentralized system. And then there's Bitcoin, which again is a completely decentralized system. However, it doesn't have the privacy. And Monero really works to add privacy to the decentralized system because it is one of the best use cases for a decentralized system. But when people realized that Bitcoin wasn't private, or it wasn't as private as they had hoped, they started adding tools on top of Bitcoin so that people could perhaps try and use these tools in order to make their transactions more private if they wanted that feature. And this is done through a Bitcoin mixer or a coin join approach. Some of you may have heard this before. Several people take their Bitcoin, they send it to a centralized server who kind of mixes up whose coins are whose, and then redistributes a fraction of each back to each person. And so ideally to an outside observer, you would no longer know that the coins a certain user had were previously used for a certain purpose because the mixer ideally could have mixed that up. But there are really 3 issues with this approach. So first, this is a system where people need to pay extra and opt in order to actually use it. And as such, the only people that go through this process are people that feel that they need to go through this process. So the vast majority of time people using this system are all sending either drug or laundered money through this type of system. So you're not exactly making yourself, more private. In fact, what you're more doing is just kind of painting a target on your back for using the system, saying, hey, I'm using a Tumblr, it's probably likely that I'm doing something shady. And that's not really a good thing. Second is this is a centralized system. You're sending your money to a server. Luckily with CoinJoin they can't steal it anymore, that's good. But they still can keep a history of how the money was distributed to each person. So to you, you might think your money is private, but to these mixers, they still know how everything was and will continue to be used. So it's not private to them. It's still something they can use in order to make their history transparent. So you need to trust the mixer, and there's no way for you to know if the mixer actually didn't keep logs like they said they were going to. So that's something that will always be a systematic issue with the centralized approach. And then finally, just from a practicality standpoint, it's slow. You need to wait for everyone else to volunteer to participate, and if you're the orange one over there and no one else is joining, you're going to be waiting a very long time for other people to show up. And so if you try to mix your coins several times, it could take perhaps weeks if you wanted to try and do it as some people would claim is the proper way to do it. And I think that having this centralized system is not really the ideal solution to privacy. We already have this decentralized system. Let's build privacy that comes from a decentralized facet on top of it, and that's where Monero is different. It uses 3 technologies and a 4th one that's in development in order to hide the privacy for all transactions. And I'm going to explain how throughout the whole scope of all the transaction history, how it's all obfuscated in detail. So just hang on for a second. So the sender is hidden with ring signatures. That hides where the money's coming from. An improvement to ring signatures also hides the transaction amount with ring confidential transactions, or ring CT. The one in development is to hide the transaction broadcast. That is done through Kavri, which is an I2P router. So I, again, will be talking about I2P a lot later. And then finally, where Monero hides the money, the destination of the money, is through stealth addresses that hide where the money's going to. So you can see throughout the whole scope of the transaction that all the information is either obfuscated or Monero is working hard to obfuscate it. So jumping directly into ring signatures, I want you to think of the entire Norwegian money supply just all in one place. So all of them in one room. And as you know, they're divided into different denominations. You have your notes of specific value, you have your coins of specific value. Monero is basically the same way. You have the total Monero money supply, and then you have this divided into different outputs of a certain amount. So basically a similar idea there. Let's say that the red one that I've highlighted here, number 8, is one that you control. It would show up in your wallet balance. It's as if you had it in your physical wallet. You have the ability to spend it. And with Monero, it tries to hide that this is actually the money that's being spent. Because if people do know the origin of the money, they could perhaps try and blacklist money from certain locations, and so that's not a good thing. And as such, to protect the fungibility, we want to make sure that they don't know where the money's coming from. So what your wallet software will do with the ring signature is you will select other money that's available, basically other outputs that you don't control. Other people control these, but you're pretending to use them at the same time. So I highlighted 5 of them in blue here, if you can see, and you're going to appear to spend all 6, including your own, simultaneously, but you're only actually spending your own. And how this actually goes into the ring signature, again, you have yours, your wallet software will select the others, and it appears as if all of these are being spent. An outside observer does not know that the number 8 is highlighted red, they don't know that's the origin. To them, they would all look very similar. And therefore, you wouldn't know which one of these 6 is actually the origin of the money that's being sent. In this example, I used a ring size of 6, so 6 total inputs. Currently on the Monero network, you need to send a transaction with at least 3 inputs, so at least 2 others. In September, it will be increased to at least 5, although there are some discussions to increase that number larger, because obviously if you hide them on more inputs, it's better than hiding them on less. If you have more possible sources of money being spent, that's better than fewer. One question we always get is if you can make it seem as if you're spending other people's money, how do you verify that someone's not actually doing that? Because that's very important. And that's where the key image is right there. The key image is like a hash of the input you do have, so of the red input. And so if you changed any of these blue ones, it wouldn't change the key image. And the network just needs to check for 2 things when you submit the transaction. One, that they haven't seen it before, so you're not trying to double spend money that you've already spent. And second, that it actually is a reference to your input, not just some random string you're trying to throw at the network and hoping that it will accept. So, as such, the key image is critical at preventing double spends. This is how the Monero ring signature looked up until January of this year. But there was a problem. People knew the value of these inputs. They knew that maybe the first one was 10 Monero, they might know the red one was 0.1 Monero, and as such, if people made quick transactions in quick succession, where I have money, I send it to user A, who immediately sends it to user B, an attacker could try and trace the amount that is being sent through the blockchain, and that's not a good thing. So how about instead of spending the whole input, let's just cryptographically commit to spending only a portion of the input that you know, and the network can still verify that you're spending as you can, but they don't know how much you're actually spending anymore. And I know this definitely gets kind of into complicated territory. It's especially for me too. I'm not a cryptographer or anything. And as such, I'm just only going to explain the basics of this. But in this example, I used about half of these inputs here. And again, an observer wouldn't know that you're only using about half, but you're not using the whole input anymore. The equation that kind of goes into this consists of two parts through what's called a Peterson commitment. The first part on the right there is the A, that's the actual amount. So if you want to send 10 Monero to someone, that would be the actual amount. We want to hide that that's actually the amount that's being spent. So as such, we add a random number to the front of it. And people can still take the sum of these two numbers for the set of inputs and outputs to verify that the amount that's being sent as an input is the same as the output. So basically someone's not printing money, that's how you verify that. But they no longer know the actual amount involved in this way. So as such, through ring CT and this commitment, Monero hides the amount that is being spent in the transactions. So putting it all together, we have this fancy ring CT ring signature, which is basically everything I previously described, which results in an unknown amount of Monero being sent, and then finally, as an output, a commitment public key, which is just something you publish to the network, including the math so that they can verify you signed it properly. So this is the ring signature in general, and this is where Monero hides, for an individual transaction, what the origin of the money is. So you can see, as like just a basic understanding, you hide your input among others, so you hide your money among others, and then you only use a little bit so people don't know how much you're actually using. So how does this look throughout the history of how the input is used throughout the whole blockchain? Because it's one thing to understand how it works for one transaction, but it's important to know that there are a lot of dynamics for how it's used throughout the whole blockchain. So I have like a theoretical blockchain on the right-hand side there, or at least like a fake one that I just kind of put there for reference. And it's the history of the red input that you do have. And where the blocks are red, that's where this input appeared in this block, or at least a block where an input appeared. There are really three ways that this can happen. So first, it could be a coin-based transaction. It could be new money. So if it's new money, it will show up on the blockchain. You know it's new money because there's no reason to hide new money among old money, because you know the new money is always the right one. So as such, you would know it would be a coin-based transaction. The second is, since you have control over this money, if you were to spend it, it would appear in the blockchain too, because there needs to be some record of it being transferred. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, someone else can borrow your input that you have in their transaction. And so they appear to spend it, but they don't actually spend it. And as such, since an outside observer does not know the difference between the second and third case, that they don't know, despite it showing up multiple times in the blockchain, whether or not it is spent all of these times or none of these times. They don't know if it shows up, whether it's actually spent or not. And that's really important. The most difficult part of Monero's privacy, in order to get it right, is to choose the inputs convincingly, the other ones that you choose. Because if you have your money you're spending and take other inputs that are not chosen very convincingly, usually this is talked about with time. So if I have money that I've recently received and I want to spend it, and my input was last used 1 block ago, and the other inputs are all last used 100 days ago. One of them looks a lot newer than the others, one stands out, and that's not a good thing. It's really bad for the inputs to really stand out. The other inputs that you select need to reflect a possible spending pattern that you would have, or else it doesn't really give you any added privacy. When Monero first launched in 2014, it chose the other inputs at pure random, so it had the same chance of choosing really old inputs as new ones, and that might sound good, but that's really bad, because people are much more likely to spend money that they've recently received than money that they've been that they've had stored in their wallet for a long time. And so it was important that Monero switched to a triangular distribution model where newer inputs are much more likely to be chosen than older inputs. Right now, the majority of other inputs are chosen within the past 1.8 days, because that's how we've noticed through our research and outside research that is how people usually spend Monero at the time. But of course, Monero will need to continue updating in order to continue to reach the ideal of how people actually spend their Monero. If that changes over time and how people spend Monero, Monero will have to change how it chooses the inputs. It's just how it works. So one thing people often forget, because it's important to know that you need to hide the information on the blockchain, but there's a lot of information leaked when you go to, when you try to have your transaction included on the blockchain. In this process of trying to get it to show up, you actually reveal a lot of information about yourself. Let's assume that you're this green origin node there. We don't need to get too much into like the whole node system. But let's say that you just want to make a Bitcoin transaction. And you need to tell the rest of the network that, hey, I would like this transaction to be included in the next block, please. And you will need to connect to the other nodes on the network to tell them this information. And some of these nodes on the network might be logging certain information about the connections they receive. Specifically, the IP address that they received this request from. And so they don't know necessarily, or at least with certainty, that the IP address they receive it from is the actual origin. If this node is logging and receives it from this node, that's obviously not the real origin of the transaction. But an attacker should be running multiple nodes in several different locations, and as such, they should have a pretty good idea. And so they still don't know anything about where your money is going to, how much you spent, or any of that information. But they can associate your transaction ID with your IP address. And then they can come to your house and say, okay, we think you made this transaction, give us your private key, please, so that we can figure out what you're trying to spend it on. And that's not a good thing. So instead of sending the transaction broadcast so that your real IP is exposed, Monero is working on a Kavri I2P router, and I2P is similar to Tor. There are many technical differences, but it is just an additional layer of the internet that will allow, similar to Tor, you relay through other nodes on the I2P network in order to hide what the origin and destination of the requests on that network actually, like what they actually are. And so as such, by using this network for the transaction broadcast, that the nodes, even if they're logging, can no longer get any important information. Instead, they just receive, instead of your real IP address, a meaningless and disposable I2P address that has no connection with you. So it's really important for Monero to have Kavri, or not even just Monero, but any cryptocurrency to have something like Kavri, so that they can allow people to hide their transaction broadcast if they need to. With Kavri, it is still in development. You can currently use it to connect to the I2P network, but it will not relay transactions from Monero through I2P at the moment. One thing that I find really cool, I suppose two things I find that are really cool about Kavri. So first is it doesn't only work with Monero, it can work with any cryptocurrency. So we would like to see Kavri also adopted by a lot of other cryptocurrencies, because it's not just Monero that can benefit from this. I mean, Bitcoin can benefit from it. So it's really important for everyone to benefit from this because there are real advantages. And second, in extreme circumstances, let's suppose your internet service provider says that you are not allowed to run a Monero node for some reason. You could tunnel all traffic through Kavri so that they would not even know that you're using Monero in the first place. They would know you're using I2P, but they wouldn't know what you're using it for. So that adds an additional layer of censorship resistance that we would like to see, I suppose, throughout all the cryptocurrencies that are currently available. So finally, onto the last part of hiding where the Monero is going to. That is done with stealth addresses. With Bitcoin, if you're familiar, you would basically send money directly to the person's address. So you just give it basically to their address and they can take it from there. With Monero, it's a little different. So instead of sending it directly to their address, we kind of send it to an output, and we basically lock this output such that no other people know who it's for, but all of the people with the wallets can search all of the boxes and only open the ones that are actually theirs. So there is no longer a link between the output and the account that's receiving it, but the accounts that are receiving it can figure out which ones are theirs. It's kind of like a one-way map there. So they look like you're sending them two addresses. I mean, they kind of look like Bitcoin addresses, just long strings. But these will never appear ever again on the blockchain, and they're not the actual addresses. If you've been keeping track, the Monero addresses themselves never appear in the blockchain, unlike Bitcoin, where that's what the whole system is basically based around. And furthermore, you don't even know that the outputs are all going to the same person. For instance, the red ones, in this example, are going to the receiver, but the blue ones are going back to the sender. This is often used if you have a very large Monero input. So let's say you have 100 Monero, but only want to send 1 to someone. You can send 99 back to yourself as change. That's how that basically works. But since there are 6 outputs here, they could be going to 6 different addresses, but no one would know. So just in summary, Monero takes an ambiguous input, so an ambiguous source of funds, takes an unknown amount of these inputs with the Peterson commitment to result in an unknown amount of Monero that's being sent, and then finally going to an unknown recipient. So for all of the information on the blockchain here, all of it is obfuscated. So that's really cool. One thing we're really vocal about in the Monero community is that privacy needs to be mandatory for it to really work. Because if only a few people use privacy, there isn't enough entropy in the system for those who need privacy to really get it. So even if you don't think you need privacy, you using the privacy features contributes to those that actually need those privacy features. So it's really important. Part of this just comes from Monero's past. About a year and a half ago, you could send a Monero transaction without hiding what the real source of the funds were. And this is a problem because only 1/3 of transactions actually hid the real source of the funds. With 2/3, they just revealed it for everyone to see. And this is a problem for 2 reasons. One, obviously that one transaction isn't as private as it could be. So if someone did that by accident, it's recorded forever. I mean, that sucks for that person. And then second, the strength of the Monero network is built upon other people borrowing other people's inputs. So if I have an input and I want to spend it, and I do spend it, it's not very convincing for me to say, hey, someone else might have borrowed it, maybe I didn't spend it, if in reality no one is borrowing each other's inputs. And so it's important for everyone to be borrowing each other's inputs. On the right-hand side here, you have a different, you have a distribution graph for a different coin that tries to offer privacy features, but only the red proportion is held privately. The green proportion is just as transparent as Bitcoin, where you know how much is in each address, where the money is going to and from. And so it's not exactly a very private system if no one's using this feature. And so it's important for it to be a feature that everyone uses for it to actually work really well. Moving on to a brief history of Monero, it was launched in April 2014 by someone named Thankful for Today. He is not involved in the project anymore because he started proposing some very controversial changes, and so the Monero core team forked the project away from him. So, like with Bitcoin, we don't know who the actual creator of the project is. In September, the network was attacked by a very motivated and capable attacker who spammed the network with a very, very large number of transactions for several days in order to cause an exploit that we didn't know about at the time, in order to force a hard fork. And this is kind of a turning point in Monero's history because the core team inherited code that they really had no idea what they were sifting through and had to figure out a way to make a secure system out of this. And it was clear that at the time they weren't doing a very good job if it could be attacked. I know the number one priority people have for their money is that someone's not going to just steal it out of the blue or something bad is going to happen to it. And so not too much seems to have happened between September 2014 and 2016, but there was a lot of background work that was happening. The Monero Research Lab published several research papers explaining how Monero could improve its privacy and security. Monero switched to a different database system, so the whole blockchain no longer needed to be stored in RAM. And so there are a million side changes like that, and even things you take for granted, like mining pools. Those all had to be built from scratch to work with Monero. So there was a lot of background work that was happening through that period. Finally, in March 2016, all transactions were made private by mandate through a hard fork. And in December, Monero launched the first beta of its graphical user interface. Up until this point, we told all users who wanted to use Monero that if they want to use it, they can use command line. And as a non-developer myself, I thought that really sucked. And so this GUI was really the first step forward and a real symbolic step at making Monero easier to use. We're on a second beta now. The third one should be out either in late August or early September in preparation for a hard fork I'll talk about later. In January of this year, Monero enabled Ring CT on the network, which closed the largest privacy leak up until this point. And then finally, in April, there was a hard fork in order to update the Monero dynamic fee and dynamic block algorithm in order just to deal with more people using Ring CT than we thought would at the time. So this is how the infamous GUI looks. There was a lot of work that went into this. I hope you can kind of just see in general how it looks. This is currently a desktop-only application. It is in the process of being ported to Android and eventually iOS. But right now it's for desktop only, but it's finally something that a normal person would feel comfortable using. The next step, though, for Monero being easier to use is a lightweight wallet. This is for people who don't want to run a full node on their computer. You can use the GUI right now if you use SPV to connect to someone else's node, but a lightweight wallet is just a better use to keep the network uncongested, basically. And so this has been in development for some time now. It's going to be an open source lightweight wallet, and this is kind of just going forward an easy to use system for people who don't want to run a whole node. So one question I always get also is if you have a system where everything is always private by mandate, how do you provide some transparency if you need it for either regulatory compliance or just to prove that you sent someone money? Like, you need some basic options for you to provide these transparency items if you need to. And this is done with the view key. I'm not going to get into the cryptography behind it, but it's this transparent key that you can give to someone that, depending on which key you hand out, they can see the incoming information for either one transaction or all the transactions associated with this account. You can give this to selected parties, so you can give this directly to your best friend or on your website for the whole world to see. That's your choice. The best explained use for this are for charities, so they can publish a donation address, put the view key with that, and then people can verify the amount that's coming into the address. The Monero website, Monero project, publishes the view key so people can see the money coming in. And then finally, parents. They can create accounts for their children, keep the view keys, and not be able to spend their children's funds, but still have a level of oversight over them. So I also want to talk about some of Monero's limitations. And I want to start first with the fact that Monero is not based on Bitcoin. The vast majority of projects that you will see in this space are forked from the Bitcoin codebase. Monero is not. It's forked from the CryptoNote codebase, which has some very big differences. And so as such, there is limited support because if Monero wants a feature that Bitcoin has, or any Bitcoin similar currency, cryptocurrency has, it needs to be rebuilt from scratch to work with Monero. And as such, Monero does not have a hardware wallet that supports it. Ledger is 6 white papers in to how they will support Monero and how they can technically do it, but they haven't actually completed the process yet, even though it is ongoing. So yes, there is interest, but it definitely takes a lot longer than maybe a weekend it would take with another cryptocurrency. And then also, we don't have a mobile wallet. So if you search for Monero wallet on your phone, you're going to come across Free Wallet, which stores your private keys. So you shouldn't use that because they could lose your money at any time. And they can see everything you're using Monero for, so there's no reason to use Monero at all at that point. But it's really close. Several projects are working on it. Koinomi has been teasing us. They're like Jaxx. They have a similar multi-platform wallet. They've been teasing the community for quite a while now, so hopefully they'll actually come out with something. The GUI is being ported. There's an APK you can download now if you want to send money that you know will be lost. My Monero is in the process of almost being done. You can sell a lot of almost, don't know due dates, as is the case in open source projects. And then Jaxx, even though there's a history of Monero and Jaxx, they have said that they would like to implement Monero again, but we don't know if they've made any progress so far. So I want to, yeah.
Yeah, I really want I missed Monero on Jaxx actually. I was like, why is it not there?
Yeah.
But it's in Shapeshift?
It is in Shapeshift.
Yeah, but not in Jaxx.
Correct.
Yeah. So I was like, what the fuck? I want to buy some Monero.
Yeah, I can talk with you. I can talk with you later about why that is, because they came close to adding it, and then it wasn't in there. So a lot of it was kind of late last year, early this year stuff. So just moving on to the ongoing development. Monero is working on multi-sig, which stands for multi-signatures. This basically allows, if you're doing like a merchant and consumer transaction, if you're the consumer and send money to the merchant, right now you need to hope that they will follow through with what they said that they would do. They already have your money, so you have to hope that they'll just kind of, act appropriately like they said they would. Multi-sig allows you to basically throw an arbitrator in between, so that if the merchant completes their side of the deal, they can finish the transaction. If they don't, they can basically cancel the transaction. And there are several other uses for multi-sig too, but that's the one that a lot of people talk about. Multi-sig is very important and is required for Monero to be added to exchanges such as Bisq, previously BitSquare, and also projects such as OpenBazaar. Subaddresses. Right now, if you publish your Monero address on your Facebook account and your super underground DJ website, even though on the blockchain there's no connection, you, through your own OPSEC, are creating a connection between yourself, between your two different parts of your life, I suppose. And you can currently get around this by just making a different Monero account, but subaddresses allow you to basically have one master account that all the money goes to, and it allows for easier management of your OPSEC. The work there has been done. It's just in the process of being peer-reviewed, and it's actually at this point really close to being merged. Translations. The Monero community has worked really hard to get translations updated for the official wallet applications, although they can definitely still use a lot of work. Like I know Swedish is there, but I don't know if Norwegian's there. And as far as documentation is concerned, it's pretty much only in English. We are finally just starting with some basic Russian and also some basic Chinese documentation, but for things like what I'm doing right now, it's all in English. So if you want to help, we just redid the website so it's not terrible to use anymore, and we can really use some help updating the documentation on that into different languages. I talked about the lightweight wallet earlier, so I won't talk about it too much here, but that again just allows people to more easily use it if they're not using a full node. Ring-CT optimizations. When Ring-CT was enabled on the network, it was in a functional yet inefficient state. So it still provides the level of privacy that we're comfortable with, but the transaction sizes are larger than they need to be. So the work is currently being done in order to reduce the size, specifically of the range proof for these, in order to cut the transaction size in a reduction between 40 to 70%, just because we're trying to figure out how much we want to reduce it at the moment. And then finally, something that as a non-developer, I'm really interested in the Monero community, within Monero, is just building out the community. Because in addition to the 4 technologies that Monero has, Monero is really only private if a lot of other people are using it. If only one of these tables here, or even if this whole room, if we were the only people in the world that use Monero, it wouldn't really be private. You need a lot of people and you need a lot of entropy in the system in order to truly have the privacy that we want to provide within Monero. So it's important for us to encourage use of Monero and also just spread just basic education about how it works, because I know when I talk to people, even if they're familiar with Bitcoin, they're often like, okay, Monero, I heard that used to be an alphabet, but that's all I know about it. So it's important to talk about the technical differences so people understand what it is and why people might have a use for it, besides drugs. So Monero has regular hard forks. If you're not familiar with hard forks, you can think of them as network upgrades, where the whole network will agree on a new series of rules, and then that will be kind of what everyone needs to follow. There was one in January that enabled ring CT, one in April that did the dynamic fees and dynamic block sizes, and then in September, you can think of this one as the privacy update. This one will bring mandatory ring CT. Right now, only 99.95% of transactions use it, so everyone will have to in September. The minimum ring size will be increased. Again, a likely number, we agreed previously on 5, however, likely will be at least 10. One crazy improvement, at least in name, is fluffy blocks. That's basically like compact blocks, if you can think about it, for Bitcoin. There is just less redundant sync data for nodes, so you don't need to use as much bandwidth. This is currently in a testing phase, just to make sure it's reliable, even if the network is disconnected for a long period of time. I imagine that for every release going forward with Monero, there will be an improved input selection algorithm, just to update for how people are using inputs in the most recent time frame. 0MQ, which is a development library. This has been actually going on for far too long, but it is finally ready to be merged. And subaddresses, which I talked about earlier, those will all be in the September hard fork. So outside of development, it's been really fun for me as mostly a community member just to see how large the community has grown since I've started following the project. So I kind of started like around here, and as you can see, there are a lot more people involved. And that means that when you have people that ask basic questions, I'm no longer the person that has to answer them, because usually a lot of other people are able to answer them for me. And it's just been really fun for me to see the community grow so much. And so you see that there's a lot greater use of Monero in transaction volume. You see that there's a lot more community participation and side projects going on. And so that's really fun for me to see. And it's also, and as you might expect, this also continues through development too. So Monero actually just surpassed Bitcoin as being as having more development, development going into the project than Bitcoin. And you can see that it is growing too. So with the growing community, we're also attracting more developers, the vast majority of which are working without any pay. They're just volunteering their time. So that's really cool to see. Now, Monero does not have the network effect that Bitcoin has. Right now, even though you can't use Bitcoin everywhere, you can at least use Bitcoin in some places. Like if you wanted to buy computer parts on Newegg, or if you wanted to perhaps go to certain restaurants, they might accept Bitcoin. So there's some acceptance, and with Monero, there's even less acceptance than what Bitcoin has. So Monero, if you have Monero right now, it's unlikely that you can directly spend it to purchase a good. Instead, you're likely going to have to convert to Bitcoin to buy something with Bitcoin. And thankfully, services such as XMR.2 or Shapeshift make it very easy for you to pay Bitcoin pay Bitcoin addresses. In this example, XMR.2, which has actually been around since before Shapeshift was around, it allows you to put a Bitcoin address, how much you want to pay how much Bitcoin you want to pay this address, and then it will give you a Monero address to send a certain amount of Monero to. And then it will immediately send the Bitcoin to the person who needs it. So this way, as long as you access the website through Tor, you have the privacy of Monero in order to make Bitcoin transactions. So I think that for the next year, maybe 2 years, depending on how things go, most people who use Monero will use Monero as a mixer basically for Bitcoin. So I think that's kind of funny. And so hopefully there will be more merchants that accept Monero directly. We've definitely seen a lot more that accept it directly this year compared to last year, so hopefully that grows. But in the fact of the matter is most people just take Bitcoin directly right now. Okay, So I hope I piqued your interest about Monero. That's all I have. So the official website is getmonero.org. Again, just got a redesign, so please feel free to explore that. There's a large community on Reddit. There's the subreddit right there. There is a very good technical community on Stack Exchange. So if you want to learn more about like the specific coin emission, or if you want to know how ring CT works on the mathematical level, that would be a great place to ask. And then finally, if you need to contact me for some reason, there's my email address, justin@ehrenhofer.org, because someone stole.com. But yeah, that's all I have. I think I'm going to open it up for questions and answers, for a Q&A session just for a little bit, if people have any questions they would like answered. But other than that, I really appreciate you coming out. I look forward to talking to you afterwards too, if you don't want to, ask a formal question now. But yeah, thanks everyone. It was a pleasure. Okay, yes?
First, thank you for your presentation. I'd like to ask you, how do you see Monero in the area of privacy cryptocurrencies?
Yeah. So, the two cryptocurrencies that people usually have me compare Monero to are Zcash and Dash. Are there any other ones you want me to throw into there? Or? Pivx? Okay. So, right now, Pivx is the same as Dash. So, there you go. They plan on doing some Zcash related things with it, but right now it's just Dash. So Dash uses the coin join approach that I talked about earlier with Bitcoin. So people will send money to a master node, the master node will mix up the coins and send them to the user. You still have the central points of failure. If they suggest you mix your coins 8 times, which is the maximum amount. If you have even a marginal amount of Dash, or like a marginally large amount of Dash, it could take weeks for you to actually mix your coins, and you would still know things like the wallet balances of the account and so forth. So I don't think that is a good enough solution to privacy for the network, especially because only a few people are using it. I mean, even if every transaction uses private send, which I estimate is less than 10% of the real reality, but if every transaction did, it still would not be good enough in my opinion, because it still has the same shortcomings as CoinJoin. And then Zcash is more interesting because you can use CoinJoin with anything. I mean, you could develop CoinJoin for Monero if you wanted to. You definitely can use CoinJoin for Bitcoin right now. So if you want to use CoinJoin for Bitcoin, there you go. Zcash is a little different because they use ZK snarks, which are zero knowledge proofs, in order to, if you use both sides of the transaction, both private addresses, Z addresses, that it would, like Monero, hide the sender, receiver, and amount in the transaction. It actually does a better job at hiding the sender. With Monero, you know it's one of X, so one of 5 in this, one of 6 in the example I showed. With Zcash, it's one in all of the possible ones that can be spent. Every input is a possible signer of the transaction. So that's obviously better. But there becomes an important distinction with implementation too. And I think there are several implementation issues with Zcash that will prevent it from allowing to have the same level of privacy that Monero offers. So with Zcash, you can send a transparent transaction, and most of them are transparent transactions because it is very computationally expensive to have a private transaction in Zcash. You need a powerful computer with, if you're lucky, 8 gigs of RAM, more likely 16 gigs, and you would need to wait several minutes for the transaction to actually sign. And as you can probably guess, no wallet provider and no exchange are going to provide that service to their customers because it's too expensive. I'm sure if Zcash became really popular, there might be one exchange or wallet provider that would do that for a large fee, but we're not there at the moment. And so as such, because it's so hard and there's no support really for these systems, we've seen that no one really uses these privacy features in Zcash. So if you look at within the past month, how many private transactions, in a way like with Monero, where it hides sender, amount, and receiver, with Zcash, there were about 400 in the past month. With Monero, there were over 30,000. So it's very important that there's the implementation is very important because otherwise people won't use it. And so Monero needed to work on its own implementation, right? We didn't used to have it mandatory, but luckily we could make it mandatory because we don't have those large computational requirements. So we just did. And so that's why people, when they're like, oh, are you afraid of Ethereum with ZK snarks or Ethereum with ring signatures, which they're going to be adding? We think it doesn't really matter because the whole system doesn't use it. And you know that within any of those systems, no, they're not going to make that mandatory. So I think that Monero is the best implemented, but Zcash is kind of, I wouldn't launch a coin with the technology, but I really appreciate the work that they did in researching it because it does provide better or potentially better untraceability. And so I think that in the future, more coins will kind of get closer and closer towards that while minimizing the implementation issues. And I didn't even mention the trusted setup with Zcash. So when they started the coin, they had several people that kind of had this master decryption key. Basically, I mean, it's much more complicated than that. But if these people colluded, and there were about 7 people, that they could just print money without people knowing within the private supply and manipulate in several ways. And in a way, it's kind of like a trusted entity. So you have to trust that the people who participated disposed of the keys like they said they would. And you don't have that issue really with any other cryptocurrency system. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to add that exactly that setup for Zcash is like making me back off from it because yeah, you really have to, you don't know who these parties are, and I mean it could be NSA or Goldman Sachs behind it, you know, and suddenly they can just print money and maybe like spy on you and everything with these keys.
Yeah, so take this with a grain of salt because it hasn't been peer reviewed or anything. It's just kind of like someone throwing an idea out there. We have ZK snarks, which is what Zcash uses. Someone proposed ZK starks, so not snarks, starks, that it basically makes a trade-off. So it removes this trusted setup, which I think is the most important thing, but it takes even more computational power. So you basically need a supercomputer to run this thing. And I think that in the future, that would be something that we're getting closer and closer towards, because if everyone has a supercomputer in like 30 years, then you might as well get the better privacy from that. So I hope that we're kind of approaching those sorts of systems. Anyone else? Yeah.
I may ask one more question.
Okay.
How do you see the future scalability system for Monero? And one must ask if the stealth addresses, the volume of the stealth addresses, affect the scalability system?
So, in the short answer to the second question, yes. Since Monero doesn't know when the outputs are actually spent, so we don't have a UTXO set, we just have a TXO set. As such, we need to keep a history of all of the outputs forever. So we can't just prune them away because we don't know when they can be pruned, basically. And same thing with the key images. We need to keep a copy of all the key images to prevent people from double spending. So Monero will have an issue, will not necessarily have an issue, but it will have that scaling issue to address because it needs to store some things forever. It can't just it can't just prune those items away. It can still get rid of all the other stuff, but it needs to keep those. And then right now, Monero transactions are much larger than a Bitcoin transaction, so it's very important to have scaling options both on-chain and off-chain. Monero, if it gets large use, so like Bitcoin level use right now, or even larger, it realistically will need an off-scale scaling solution like Mimblewimble or Lightning Network in order to actually make it work. So it's important just on-chain kind of reduce the impact transactions have. Most notably, that's through the efficient range proof that we're kind of still working on. And so right now it's not that big of an issue because our blockchain's 15 gigabytes about, but if Monero became much more popular, it theoretically could be a much larger problem. I think one of the biggest threats to Monero is if it gets much larger use very suddenly, and the network is not able to reach consensus on any future upgrades, that will be a problem because the transactions will be too large for normal people to run it on their nodes. And so that's something that we obviously want to minimize the impact of, and why it's just something that we're focusing heavily on. So I don't think it's an issue unless we get to the situation where we can't do a network upgrade. Just because we still have several options. We have things like we have the efficient ring CT, we have sharding, we have pruning, we have second layer solutions, and a lot of these are still kind of being devised, but we're kind of just optimistic about the research in the space at the moment. But yes, Monero will need something to, the transactions are larger than Bitcoin because you have more stuff in the blockchain, right?
Where do you see this in the timeline for Monero?
I would say start looking at Monero, I'd say maybe 2 years for at least a good knowledge of how the second layer solution will be implemented, I imagine. So did you still have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering about plausible deniability.
About plausible deniability?
Yeah.
So, realistically, within Monero, you don't know if you don't know what parties are involved in the transaction. So, if your input is borrowed and sent by someone else in the transaction, two things. One, they wouldn't know that your input was actually, like that input that was borrowed is connected to you. So you don't need to worry about this disconnect. And second, even if for some reason they had this information, they wouldn't know if it was actually spent. So I think that there is no way for them to, for a user, there's no risk to the user of someone claiming they made a transaction because they would have no proof to base it on.
But if I spend my Monero something, won't I change some delta so that you can serve it that way?
Yeah, so if you're going to buy something, if you make a Monero transaction, you take your real input and you go to spend it and you hide it among others. Well, people don't even know that that input you do have is actually yours. If you recently got it from an exchange, for instance, so if you got it from Poloniex, withdrew it to your wallet, and then directly sent it to someone else, like back to Poloniex, that is a concern. So those type of attacks are things we're definitely looking at. They're kind of like EAE attacks, I believe. Maybe it's E. There are several complicated attacks that we're looking at for some of those high risk models, and currently the solution we're thinking of, which wouldn't be like a network mandated item or so forth, but you can currently, if you have a large concern like that, it's called churning. So you basically send money back to yourself several times, and then they wouldn't be able to, I mean, even in cases where they would have a guess, they wouldn't know for sure. There'd be no way for them to have proof. But with the churning process, it would remove their suspicion also, which is important. But it totally depends how people are using their Monero. We can't really enforce churning on the protocol level, but we can make it an easier option or a more visible option for people who want it, which is the research at how big of a threat this actually is currently underway. So we have 2 full-time researchers that are at, like, this is their focus. So yes, we're definitely still looking at those type of threats. But if you only transact with one party once from an account, you will never have to worry about this issue. It's if you do it like multiple times or back through certain recipients and so forth. So yes, it's something that you should be aware of, and depending on your threat model, something you should definitely do more research into. Yes?
Yeah, so I have one question. Given Monero's nature of placing so much importance on
Yeah.
Because when it comes to, for example, government oversight and business adaptation, it has to kind of be a problem somewhere when it comes to completely pricing.
Yeah. So, I imagine that a lot of people will use it as a store of value. If they want a private store of value, they can use Monero. Right now, based off market cap, you can't put billions of dollars in here as a private store of value currently. Or I would really appreciate it if you did. How about that? If you attempted to do that, I would appreciate it. But no, really, I think my best answer is just it will be used for whatever people feel that they want to have a use for it. And that doesn't really, I know that doesn't mean anything, that doesn't contribute really anything. It's kind of just a word you're hearing. But it's like it's a digital cache. It functions, it is the first implementation where it has the same level of privacy of cache. And so what are people going to use that for? And right now, at least the most publicized use, not necessarily based off transaction volume or anything, but Monero was mostly heard of by many people, probably from botnets, from the previous mess with Alphabet, getting Monero being added, and then Alphabet being shut down, and all over the place. And so I think right now you probably see a lot of people who use Monero use it, or at least the people who do use it, are people that know very clearly that they want the privacy advantages from it. And so it was like the internet. You had people that adopted it the first were the people that were not the best people in the world, right? They were using it for illicit purposes. Monero is probably a very similar way, except you also have a lot of traders kind of thrown in there too. And so Monero needs to encourage legitimate use. There are many legitimate reasons for privacy that people would want. For instance, if you are making a campaign contribution, you probably don't want your employer to know who you're giving money to. Or if you are purchasing porn or something stupid like that, you probably don't want that to be connected with you, or at least a lot of people wouldn't. And so we just need to encourage those sort of legal uses. And I imagine that as the community gets larger, that will help too. Because if the community is small and not that many people know about the project, the people who use it are going to people that go out of their way to learn about a privacy-related project for storing value and so forth. So we need to kind of encourage everyone to start using it in order to not remain like a niche group only for, not that Monero necessarily always was, but has a lower probability of turning into a niche group specifically for people to use it for illicit purposes. Because that is awful for me as someone talking about it. It's awful for the developers who are making this tool for people to use. And so it just really would suck for everyone. So, very important. Okay, so I think we're all questioned out. So I'm going to let you all get another beer or whatever. And again, thank you so much for coming out. Website, getmonero.org. And again, if you need to find me, just search Justin Monero and I'll show up somewhere. So, thank you again. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, so on behalf of Oslo Bitcoin Meetup, I really want to thank you for coming and having this presentation. It was very interesting, and it shows also the lack of fungibility and privacy in Bitcoin. So again, I want to thank you and give you a big hand.
Thank you.